On May 10, 1862, Federal troops landed at Ocean View, Virginia, and marched towards the city of Norfolk. They were met by 2 cannons at the other side of the Indian Pole Bridge, which was burning, requiring them to march around the river system of Norfolk. They were met by the mayor of Norfolk, who surrendered the city to Federal authorities. This began the occupation of Norfolk. Soon afterwards, the decision was made to turn Fort Norfolk into a prison camp. On August 7, 1862, Brigadier General Egbert Veal, the commanding general in Norfolk, wrote to Major General John Dix, "I have at Fort Norfolk accommodations for 100 prisoners. In a day or 2 will be ready for 200. There is now 1 company on guard there." Fort Norfolk was transformed from a naval magazine into a prison camp. It not only held Confederate prisoners, but also held civilians and convicted United States military personnel. The magazine was converted from a place to store powder to a collection of cells for housing Confederate prisoners of war. The officers' quarters was transformed from a cannonball manufacturing facility to a prison for civilians. The barracks was transformed to a prison for convicted Union soldiers. Major General John Dix makes it very clear in his letter to Major General Henry Halleck on May 25, 1863, that political prisoners were being held at Fort Norfolk. He told the general that they have no place to house officers near Fort Monroe except Fort Norfolk, which always has had a large number of political prisoners and soldiers under sentence or awaiting trial. Conditions for Confederate prisoners at Fort Norfolk were not good. An excerpt from a September 1863 letter by Robert Ould, the Confederate agent for exchange, stated, "I beg to state that full and satisfactory evidence was presented to me that as many as 15 of our officers were confined at Fort Norfolk in a room about 15 feet square, with no window, but only a simple slit in the wall, that they were not allowed to go out of that room at all, but were compelled to perform the operations of nature there in a tub, which was only removed once in 24 hours. The only place in Fort Norfolk that matches this description is the magazine, which was divided up into 15-foot by 15-foot cells, with no heat in the winter. The smell inside the magazine must have been horrific from all of the human waste. Luckily for the Confederate prisoners, their imprisonment was generally between 1 day and 3 months. The reason for the short stays was the fact that the Union Army and the Confederate Army were regularly exchanging prisoners. Flag of truce boats went up and down the James River regularly, taking prisoners from Fort Norfolk and other Union prisons up the river to City Point, where they would be exchanged for Union prisoners of equivalent rank. 2 Confederate diaries have been located which describe conditions in Fort Norfolk. The first is by the Reverend Peter Tinsley, an Episcopal priest who served as chaplain with the 28th Virginia Regiment and was captured at Gettysburg after he stayed behind to bury the dead and tend to the wounded. He states, "We are introduced to the interior of the fort. Find there about 50 or 60 surgeons and about a dozen chaplains. Are told that this is a permanent abiding place. We have as quarters brick buildings, at the present season the temperature at 100 degrees approximately. They seem to be ovens. We have the liberty of a small yard enclosed by a high wall." The second diary belongs to little Barry Allen. Captain Allen writes in his diary, The Lady Friends of Norfolk were permitted to bring or send in anything of food or clothing. We shall have reason always to remember Miss Sarah Lee and Mrs. Newton. They were incessant in their attentions to us. I needed money. Miss Lee gave me money in greenbacks. The only currency I had, a large sum of Confederate money and some Virginia funds, but they were of no value. In Fort Norfolk, we had daily prayer meetings and preaching twice each Sunday and in different houses occupied by prisoners. There was a number of privates among them. In about 12 days, these were sent off for exchange, and among them my 2 men, Tinsley and Freeman, went to City Point. Conditions for the civilian prisoners were also bad. Based on the evidence we have, civilian prisoners were held in the officers' quarters, including the graffiti room. This building had very small windows and no heat in the winter. No bunks were provided for sleeping. The prisoners had to sleep on the floor. Based on correspondence about the prisoners, they were locked in the building and only allowed out at certain times. They were forced to use a tub to do their human functions, so the smell in these buildings must also have been horrific. In fact, evidence from the graffiti wall shows the tub being dumped over a guard's head, making him sick and causing him to throw up. Civilians could be placed in Fort Norfolk when they were convicted of a crime by a military court or awaiting trial. Civilians could also be placed in the fort without any charges against them. They could be arrested for any reason and put in the fort. A prime example of this is found in a court-martial held at Fort Norfolk. The case of Wilson Butts was taken up and investigated by a military commission. There were no charges on file at the office against the prisoner, and no witnesses appearing against him. After he was duly sworn, he was allowed to make a statement of his case as follows.
Would you like to make a statement to the court?
Yes, I would. I live in Norfolk, Virginia. I've lived there about 38 years. I have a family of a wife and 4 children. I've never been in Confederate service except when employed as a mechanic. I'm a carriage maker by trade, and I've been in Richmond. I left home for Richmond in August of 1862 and remained there until September of 1863 when I came back. My family remained in the city of Norfolk during my absence. My wife wrote for me to come home, and I returned with the intention of remaining inside the federal lines. I was arrested about 9 miles from Norfolk by the Jackals. I was on my way home then. I proposed to and am willing to take the oath of allegiance to the United States government and remain loyal to the federal government.
After carefully considering the sworn statement of the prisoner, Wilson Butts, the commission recommended that he be released from prison and allowed to return to his home in the city after taking the oath of allegiance to the United States. The trial took place November 18, 1863. This prisoner had been in Fort Norfolk for 2 months without any charges or a trial. Convicted Union soldier prisoners were kept in the old enlisted barracks at the fort, but their conditions were probably very similar to the civilian and Confederate prisoners. The most famous Union prisoner at Fort Norfolk was Edward Z. Judson, a private in the New York 1st Mounted Rifles. He was sentenced to 2 months' imprisonment at Fort Norfolk for the crime of desertion. Edward Judson was better known as Ned Buntline. Ned Buntline was a writer, journalist, and publisher. Black prisoners and convicted Black Union soldiers were confined in the small cookhouses in the fort. Several convicted U.S. black soldiers were allowed to sleep outside the walls of the fort. Visiting days at the fort were twice a week, when civilians came from town to visit the prisoners. These visits were usually held on the first floor of the magazine keeper's house, just outside the walls of the fort. The first regiment known to have been assigned to Fort Norfolk as prison guards was the 148th New York Regiment. Private Silas W. Dickerson of that regiment drew this map of Fort Norfolk, which shows the guard camp next to the fort. The camp of the regiment was probably on the east side of today's Colley Avenue. On January 2, 1864, Company B of the 1st Regiment of U.S. Colored Troops was ordered to Fort Norfolk as prison guards. On January 13, 1864, Companies H and K of the 2nd Massachusetts Heavy Artillery was ordered to replace the U.S. colored troops as prison guards. Colonel Jones Frankel, the commanding officer of the 2nd Massachusetts Artillery, wrote a description of the condition of the fort after he took command.
The gate of the fort has no fastening whatsoever. The magazine or dungeon, I am unable to tell which it was intended for originally, has been partially torn down and the bricks taken away. The guardhouse is in wretched condition. The interior slopes are almost entirely destroyed. The door of the prison for confinement of court-martialed offenders has no fastening. Both prisons were in very bad condition when I came here, but having been whitewashed and cleaned, are now quite comfortable. The counterscarp has been dug away in a great many places. Sinks and cookhouses have been built upon the edge. A great many bricks have been taken out from the wall, apparently to build chimneys for the cookhouses and floor huts with. The quarters inside the fort, assigned for the use of colored prisoners, are entirely unfit for the purpose. Being originally intended for a cookhouse and having but 4 bunks, I found several of the colored prisoners in the habit of sleeping outside the fort, with the consent of the commanding officer. There really being no room for them inside, all the interior of the fort needs sodding. The small magazine has been very much damaged and a great deal of the brickwork destroyed. In short, I found nothing as it should be.
On April 3, 1864, Major General Butler issued Special Order No. 93, which instructed Captain Haswell C. Clark to turn over the fort to the officer appointed by Acting Rear Admiral S.P. Lee. As a result of this order, the fort would return to use as a naval magazine.